Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Merlin Crossley. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Science. To begin, I'd like to welcome you to UNSW, and in doing so, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this hall is built, the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to pay respects to their elders past, present and future. My understanding is that in ancient times, the population of the Cadigal people was somewhat less than the current total population of Sydney. Tonight we're going to discuss what is a sustainable population for Australia. At UNSW, we hold a lot of lectures, but we have recognised that 60-minute monologues are not the only way of communicating. In lectures, only one point of view is given, and an hour is a long time to listen to a single speaker. I happen to be a great fan of Tony Jones' ABC program Q&A, and we have borrowed his format. We have recognised that we need to include experts with different viewpoints. Tonight I've invited two academics, Wendy Sure from my own faculty, who is a human geographer, and Nigel Staples, an economist from the Australian School of Business. The Faculty of Science is delighted to co-host this event together with the Australian School of Business. Professor Kevin Fox from the ASB will close the proceedings this evening, and I am delighted to have science and business working together. It's worth remembering that whether we like it or not, it is not only physics, but money that makes the world go round. We have also invited three people from outside UNSW who are what I shall call thought leaders. They have been carefully chosen. Persuasive argument requires the intelligent accumulation of data, communication of the information, and leadership and decision-making. Many or all of you will know about Dick Smith and know of his many public roles. I don't know how Dick sees himself, but I first saw him as a scientist. I saw him on television doing a program carrying out an experiment that beautifully exposed water divining as an illusion. He set up a wonderful experiment which he designed in consultation with adherents of the art of water divining. He convinced them that it was a valid experiment, and then he asked them to test their art. And he demolished the hypothesis. He was one of the first myth-busting scientists I'd seen, and I'm delighted to welcome him here tonight. Ross Gittins is a gifted communicator. People see journalists in different ways, but in my early days, I admired and read a great deal of work by people like Eric Blair, who you all know as George Orwell, and Arthur Koestler, both who were economic journalists of their time. Economic journalists are important public leaders, and they can be seen as heroes, although they're not always seen that way. On the other hand, many of you will have read Stieg Larsson's recent trilogy about dragon tattoos, and the hero there, Mikael Blomqvist, is, like Ross, an economic journalist. And I'm delighted we have a thought leader just like Ross here tonight. We also have Bob Carr. Bob Carr is a leader of the highest order. Again, I do not know how Bob sees himself, but I always associate Bob Carr with someone from history whom he is known to admire. I associate Bob Carr with the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. I was taught about Marcus Aurelius when I was younger, and I was taught he was the last great emperor. And after Aurelius, there was, to my mind, a period of darkness that shrouded around Rome until the Renaissance. People may have different political views, but I think many would say that Bob was New South Wales' last great premier, and we hope that New South Wales will soon once again see a renaissance. But before I close, I want to say a few words about science. I remember the teacher putting a candle in a jar and closing the lid and timing to wait as she waited for the candle to go out. All the oxygen was used up, converted to carbon dioxide, and that supports no flame. Then the same experiment was done with 2 candles, and the time the flame burnt was shorter. This told me that on Earth there are some finite resources. The more humans we have, the more quickly our resources will be used up. One day, finite resources will run out and waste products will accumulate and threaten the fragile candle of life. Scientists tell us that resources are finite. Scientists are human, and perhaps one cannot always trust humans, but the process of science sits above human self-interest, and one can trust the scientific process. Many people do appreciate that things are finite, but there is confusion because not everything is finite. Mathematics is infinite, economics deals with infinite progressions, human creativity and ingenuity appear to have no limit, and many processes happily run in cycles, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, etc. So we sometimes forget that the world has finite resources. But things are finite, and the fact that the planet has finite resources suggests that we would be wise to restrict ourselves to having a finite population. That said, I'm interested to hear what the panel and the audience thinks about whether Australia's population is the right size. We have neighbours in our region with much higher populations. These people exist and they have increasing needs. One wonders at the ethics of turning needy guests away from our doors and our shores. We are a country of immigrants, but we have a strangely mixed history of welcoming and demonising immigrants. But enough from me. I now wish to hand over to our host for this evening, who had a formidable scientific training and is an advocate of science and the public understanding of science. I am an amateur at public forums, but our question master, Paul Willis, is a professional. He will be well known to you from his work on ABC's Catalyst and other science programs throughout Australia. I'm delighted to hand over to Paul, who will now formally introduce the panellists and begin the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Merlin. If this is a Q&A format, then I must be the B-grade Tony Jones, and I actually take that as a bit of a compliment. Thank you very much. Tonight we have a lot of interesting discussion to get through. I'd first of all like to just outline the format of the evening. That is, we will have presentations lasting 5 minutes, and in order to sustain the evening, they will be 5 minutes from each of our speakers. And then there will be a question time. We will hopefully be able to take questions from the floor. There are microphones that I'll guide you to when we come to that moment. Sustainability, it's a word that is bandied around quite freely. Everyone seems to have a sustainable angle on virtually everything they do. But can we build a sustainable nation? Can we sustain the current population? Should we be looking at a different population structure and model for this country? We have a lot of questions around the issues surrounding sustainability. And we have no better panel than the panel assembled for you tonight to discuss that. I'll introduce them as they come to the lectern for their particular talk. And first cab off the rank is Dick Smith. Now, we all know Dick Smith. His endeavours in so many fields ended up winning him a position as a living Australian national treasure in 2005. And of all the things in the biography that you could say about Dick, the one that stands out is that he holds strong opinions, and while you may not agree with him, you have to admire the sincerity with which he puts his case. And to put his case in exactly 5 minutes, please welcome to the stage Dick Smith.
I don't know what you can say in 5 minutes. By the way, put up your hand if you're under 30. Good to see, because people of my age and older, we've buggered the country for you, I can tell you, buggered the world. Sustainable, well, You hear all the time sustainable population, sustainable business. One of them I heard recently, sustainable population growth, impossible. As far as I'm concerned, sustainable means that in any given period, the goods and energy you use are replaced. There's no net change. And we're certainly a long way from that now. Because of fossil fuel oil and coal, we use something like double the amount of resources and energy that we replace each year. Of course, it's allowed our population to go to over 6 billion people. Of course, our free enterprise system, which I've benefited from greatly, is not based on sustainability. It's based and totally addicted to constant exponential growth in the use of energy and resources. In fact, we measure the success of every capitalist by growth. We'll sack the CEO of Woolworths if the company doesn't grow every year. We'll throw the government out if you don't have growth in GDP. In fact, we've had 200 years of growth, primarily based on the fossil fuels. Millions of years that were laid down from energy from the sun used in a couple of hundred years. Now, even the ultimate capitalist, Rupert Murdoch, wrote me a letter and said, well, Dick, I tend to agree with you that 100 million people sounds too many for Australia. So what you'll find is most of us capitalists, we believe in growth now for our benefits, because with growth the wealthy will get wealthier. But most of us are wise enough to say, well, in the longer term, you can't always grow because you'll run out of resources and energy. And most of my friends say, well, Dick, you're right, but it's centuries away, let's not worry about it. And it's interesting because many people state that capitalism can't work without growth and that we'll need a new economic system based on idealism and cooperation. I don't think that's going to happen. I believe capitalism will work very well without the constant exponential growth of the uses of resources and energy. Capitalism worked without slavery. It's interesting, back in the 1830s, people said 2,000 years of slavery. If you don't have slaves, first of all, capitalism will collapse, and secondly, the slaves will starve. In 1830s, slavery was abolished, capitalism just adapted. We now have some of the strongest environmental laws you could ever believe, but capitalism works around it because the efficiencies are great, 2 or 3% per year of productivity increases. And as long as it's an even playing field, there's not a problem. Up until the Second World War, the efficiency gains from capitalism was used to reduce working hours. Since the Second World War, the efficiency gains of 2 or 3% per year have been used to make more stuff. So you go into a large shopping centre and 50% of what's there is rubbish. But we have to keep buying it because if we don't, there will be recession, people will be out of work. We have 22 million people in Australia now. We could put 5 Dubais between Sydney and Cairns. We could go up to 100 million people if we use every bit of coal, every bit of uranium. But what would the advantage be? I can tell you, for wealthy people like Rupert Murdoch and myself, we'll make more money. But for typical Australians, double the population, everyone's worth half as much. 8 out of the 10 wealthiest countries on earth have small populations, around 10 million, and they're stable. And it's interesting, there's great potential to use our capitalistic system, but not to rely on this exponential growth of the use of resources. Fortunately, the amount of energy coming into the earth every day is thousands of times more than we need. So all we have to do is move from an economic system that's moved away from one which is based on the growth of resources and energy to one which has a different form of growth. In other words, growth in efficiencies, removing waste. We need a new measure for GDP. In other countries they have the Gross Progressive Index, which instead of just talking about having more wealth, more resources, talks about quality of life and other things. So what I'm saying is basically, if we don't do something, we're sleepwalking to disaster. It won't affect people of my age, the politicians there today, but for young people under the age of 30, we can either decide that we are like locusts and we go from boom to bust, or possibly we could be like some of the other wonderful creatures we have in Australia which live in balance with the environment. Thank you.
One thing, living within your limits, but talking within your time frame. Great example set for Nigel Staples. Nigel is an economist here at the University of New South Wales, where he is head of the Australian School of Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Nigel Staples.
Thank you, Paul. I'm a bit wary. Ross is coming after me, so he's warned me. In the 1960s, sort of when I was sort of growing up, Bill Walkley of the Walkley Award fame dreamed of Australia holding 150 million people. He'd looked at California and the US by example. At the same time, we had Paul Ehrlich of the population bomb fame arguing that Australia could support just 10 million people. Well, we've moved on a little bit since then. But before I sort of address specifically that question, I want to look at sort of the global picture, because Australia lives in a global world. Since 1800, a combination of technology and an economic system which has been conducive to growth has seen dramatic rises in GDP per capita in many countries, including Australia. Now, in the period up to about the 1970s, that technological change also brought with it very rapid growth in population. And the combination of rises in GDP per capita and a sharply rising world population saw a dramatic increase in the human footprint on the world. Interestingly though, in the last 30 or so years, we have observed something different, that the rise in GDP per capita has led to significant declines in birth rates to below replacement. So in a country such as Japan, with no or negligible immigration, their population is starting to decline. In Japan's case, its human footprint on the world is also starting to decline, and the same is the case for a number of other rich countries. And it's also the case in the rich countries that without the worries of day-to-day survival, these countries are spending more on the environment. Now, to our north, if we look to China and India, we have two big countries aspiring to join the rich club. Now, China is doing better at that, lifting its GDP per capita, which means at present it's rapidly increasing its human footprint on the world. And yet the likelihood is that when China, in the next 2 decades, even excluding the one-child policy, which I expect it to repeal, will have a sustained low birth rate and also an increased focus on the environment. That is, China is essentially following Japan. Now, India is lagging behind China at present, which means it is making less of an imprint on the world. But to the extent that it lags China in increasing its GDP per capita, its birth rate will remain high. And there will be a tipping point at some point in the future where, despite its lower per capita imprint, by sheer dint of its population, India would be the country with the bigger footprint on the world. The hope, and my great hope, is that in its own way, India will emulate China. The point I want to make here is that there is a self-correcting mechanism happening whereby, via higher GDP per capita, it is leading to lower birth rates. So while the world's population is projected to rise another 30% or so by 2050, significantly, courtesy of that self-correcting mechanism, we are going to see a peak and then a decline in the world's population. Ironically, policies which work to thwart the transformation of poor countries to joining the rich club might, in the very long term, be seen as detrimental to the environment. Now, turning to Australia, I do not believe that Australia can cut itself off from the world. Our population will continue to grow courtesy of immigration, whether it be 30% to 29 million, or the Treasury projection of 36 million by 2050, that's anyone's guess. But there is zero chance that it's going to stay at around 22 million. Now, for Australia, immigration has benefits which can be weighed up against costs, which is the way economists look at it. So we can think of benefits as being addressing our ageing population issue, costs, increased congestion. Now, one of the benefits is the externality we can get as a good world citizen in contributing to world economic welfare, and that is to the extent that we bring in cohorts of poor people, people from poor countries, we can lift their standards of living and at the same time lower the birth rates of those cohorts of people. And so while Australia is a small country, that in a small way is going to assist that self-correcting mechanism which will see the world's population peak and decline. Now, just briefly on what is a sustainable population. The capacity of any country to support a population is a function of technology, which is constantly changing. Without the advances in technology since 1800, Australia would be able to support just a small portion of the population we have today. And looking forward, there is every reason to expect that advances in technology will come along that enable, for example, more efficient ways of using scarce water, carbon-intensive energy and the like, which will see, even if 29 or 36 million is a sustainable population today, that figure will become larger tomorrow. And just one final point, if the economic signals, the price signals, are allowed to do their job, even with existing technology, for example, more efficient use of our water, we can generate more favourable outcomes for the environment, even with 29 or 36 million people. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is New South Wales' longest-serving Premier, and amongst the notable achievements during his premiership, that he was in fact the first government in the world to introduce a carbon credit scheme, and also that the Carr government led curbing of the clearing of native vegetation as a way of reducing greenhouse effects on the environment. So please, for his 5 minutes in the spotlight, would you welcome Bob Carr?
I'm tempted to do a Tony Abbott and go down there and speak to you from the front. Remember, he did that as a token of his sincerity, speaking in that debate in a Western Sydney club. First fact, you don't have global warming without global swarming. The population of the planet has been doubled since 1970. 1970, when some of us were studying in this university or were a couple of years out of it, the population of the planet, 3.5 billion. It's now 7.5 billion. Isn't that a great achievement? Since 1970, we've doubled the size of the most destructive and creative species on the planet. Doubled, intensified the numbers. And we wonder why the ice caps are melting away and why the rainforests are becoming extinct. The people 30 years and under here might live to see a planet without ice caps and a planet without an Amazonia. What a noble experiment. What a great species we are. What creativity. Isn't that fantastic? No one asked the Australian people whether they were in favour of a bigger Australia. No Prime Minister gave an address to the nation. John Howard and then Kevin Rudd thought they'd just slip through. The Business Council of Australia was thrilled by the effective doubling of immigration, and no media was reporting it. And Kevin Rudd thought he could let it slip out by saying, I believe in a bigger Australia. And then the public reaction set in, because the Australian people have got high civic IQs, and they understood what this argument meant. It means, for example, it doesn't mean the population of Kalgoorlie is going to go up, or Broken Hill, or Orange, or any of those cities in inland New South Wales where water problems are so acute. They're not going to see a doubling of their population. It's going to be non-stop urban intensification along the East Coast. It's going to be shopping malls and tract housing and high-rise down the eastern coast of Australia. That's where it's going to be. Let's dispose of two arguments. It really irritates me when I hear these arguments. Someone said on the 7:30 report, remember their week-long examination of this issue, Australia Day this year, which opened up this debate. Someone said, an economist said, oh, it's all a matter of planning. There should be a national planning commission to take it off the states. Real smart. You just take it off the states, transfer it to a bureaucracy in Canberra, and overnight the planning difficulties caused by ramped up high adventure immigration vanish. Well, how does anyone get to believe in such rubbish? The fact is, the capital cities of Australia have got pretty robust plans. Sydney is achieving rates of urban consolidation of 70%. In Melbourne, they're only at 50%. That's good planning. It means less urban sprawl. We've got that down. But all the Australian capitals have got basically good, robust plans. But if, without consulting the people and thinking you can get away with it by stealth, and sitting in Canberra, which has got no problems of urban growth, except a water shortage that restricts new suburban development, that's interesting, virtually overnight, we'll double immigration. The pressures are great. The planning pressures are acute. And while Malcolm Turnbull says, oh, Wentworth has high population densities, we can live with this, I believe in a big Australia, he says, he was notably silent when a state planning minister had to persuade the people of Ku-ring-gai, over the opposition of Malcolm Turnbull's fellow Liberal Party members, that they should accept a reasonable measure, which is high rise along the rail line. Good planning. It's happening everywhere else in Sydney, an intensification of development along transport arteries. It ought to happen in Ku-ring-gai. But no, Liberal Party saying no, Malcolm overlooks that completely. No one supports a state government when they say population growth means we go up or we go out. And in Sydney, quite correctly, we've made a decision to go up. Intensification of existing development. It's all a matter of planning, say the high population growth lobby, as if that could happen overnight without stress or without argument. It's all a matter of infrastructure, they say. Oh, as if no one had thought of that. I was Premier for 10 years, 61 billion spent on infrastructure, everything from the Windsor Road to the Epping-Chatswood rail link to nearly $1 billion worth of bus freeways in Western Sydney, to rebuilding of virtually every hospital in the state, and to stormwater traps at the beaches to give us clean swimming, and steel fences around the schools for the first time to protect them from vandalism. Heaps of infrastructure. But you double immigration and you're always struggling to keep up. The real infrastructure crisis in Australia was in the 1950s, when we had high immigration proportionately and very little attention to the new public works infrastructure that was required. It's not all a matter of infrastructure. It's not solved by planning. We've got good planning. You double immigration, as Canberra did stealthily in the dead of night without consulting the Australian people, and the pressures are serious. I don't want to see Eastern Australia intensively urbanised. I don't think we're a better civilisation because of that. No more is the planet better because we're going to add by 2050 another 3 billion people to guarantee that every rainforest is replaced by a palm oil plantation, and that every one of the great mammals of Africa is finally extinct because of the population pressures. We're the species that is dominant. We've doubled our numbers in the last 40 years. Enough is enough. The growth is going to have to taper off at some point. 2050 is nominated for Australia, for the world, by which time we get used to sustaining an economy without the artificial pressure of forced population growth. Why not get used to it now while there's a bit of the natural world still to be saved?
Thank you very much, Bob. We now come to our second academic from the University of New South Wales tonight. Wendy Sure is a human geographer from the Faculty of Science, and she has particular interests in city living, urbanality, cosmopolitanism, and the complex realities of post-colonial life in Australasia. Please, would you welcome Dr. Wendy Sure.
Okay, I'm a human geographer and I'm officially a member of the chattering disciplines, so I thought. But I'm particularly interested in discourse, or talk. And much of what I hear about a sustainable Australia seems to rest on a core debate about the nation's population, to grow or to stem it through restrictions to immigration. So is this really where the issue of sustainability lies? So my first question, I think, for tonight is, what do we mean by sustainability? And as you can see up here, there's a few definitions. It became a buzzword in the 1960s, was popularised in the 70s at the United Nations Stockholm Conference, and it hit centre stage at the 1980 World Conservation Strategy, and again in 1987 at the UN-appointed World Commission of Environment and Development. Since those events, sustainability has become a term used in many discourses. Sustainability usually refers to something that is able to be maintained. We're probably all aware of that. But if we think about it from an environmental perspective, the approaches usually fall into two categories. First, the technocentric approaches, which rely on existing economic and political structures but demand responsiveness through interventionist strategies. Second, there are the ecocentric approaches, which demand redistribution of power towards something more decentralised, such as global villages. And these strategies fall into Gaianism and communalism, which many of you have probably heard of. So what does this mean for a sustainable Australia? To me, we need to decenter the techno and eco approaches and think more about context. It is only possible to achieve a more environmentally sustainable nation if we think about it in terms of the global. Currently, there are just under 7 billion people on Earth, as we've heard, with 20 or so million of us here in Australia. And we've probably all heard that the wealthier 20% of the world's population consume more than 80% of the world's resources. How does this happen? Well, there's an international division of labour and production. This means that here in Australia we can afford to be clean and green, because the post-industrial era here has resulted in a neo or new industrial era elsewhere. In places where labour is cheap, in nations or regions where with too many poor people, this new industrialism means that it is easy to send the blame offshore along with the dirt and the industry. But this is consumer driven. And according to that great authority, a wiki estimate is that there are currently 18 million shipping containers making over 200 million trips a year. And I'm no mathematician, but is that something like 3.6 quadrillion? I don't know, it's a huge number regardless. It's a lot of stuff and it's a lot of fossil fuels to transport all that stuff. And by the way, about 10,000 of them fall off the ships and are lost at sea each year. So trouble if you're on the water in a shaky, leaky boat. And did you know that there are about 1 million, or I'm not sure what the estimate is, but about 1 million, let's say, people flying right now in planes. That's a lot of fuel-drinking planes in the air. And who is on those planes? The largest mobile group globally is under 20 years old, female and poor, travelling for domestic work, but often ending up, and I'm sorry, Dick, there is slavery and plenty of it. If we think about a very basic global statistic, that of life expectancy here in Australia, it is now about 82. But Haitians have a life expectancy of 30, 45 if you're an Afghani, and between 40 and 50 in 9 African countries. These expectancies, of course, are lowered in war zones or due to natural disasters and so on, but they remain consistently very low in certain parts of the world. Certainly Australia needs to reduce its carbon footprint, and with a little vision, Sydney could be a shining example. And part of lowering our footprint must mean that we are vigilant to the bigger global community footprint. And just to finish, to borrow from Tony Abbott's election campaigning, to end the waste, yes, let's reduce the rampant consumption of non-renewable resources. And we have probably all heard about the giant islands of plastic floating around the Pacific and Atlantic oceans. And the other thing he promised, to stop the boats. Well, that's just ironic, really. And I also thought, I know it's a bit old, but hey. I also thought that it was pretty un-Australian when the Australian government under Howard said no to the Tuvaluan government who was seeking refugee status for their people based on environmental reasons. Wouldn't it just be productive to say no, or at least not so many, to those other boats full of shipping containers rather than a few asylum seekers? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Our last panel member for the evening will be known to you for his work in the Sydney Morning Herald as the economic columnist. Ross Gittins also has a new book out with the title The Happy Economist, which must share the dubious distinction of being both a tautology and an oxymoron in the one phrase. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ross Gittins.
Well, thank you. My strongest reason for opposing continuing high levels of immigration, net migration, is my scepticism about the airy assurances from economists and others that continued population growth is compatible with an ecologically sustainable Australia. Economists offer these assurances not because they've thought deeply about Australia's ecological carrying capacity, it's not a subject they know much about, but because they're used to thinking about the economy in isolation from the environment, and because they have a suspiciously convenient faith, which we heard from Nigel earlier, in the ability of technological advance to solve environmental problems. I must say that if you look at the way technology has advanced our use of water so far, it's made those problems worse rather than better. All we need to do is start turning back the rivers. That'd help, I'm sure. There is this convenient faith in the ability of increases in man-made capital to substitute for the depletion of non-renewable resources, the over-exploitation of renewable resources, the degradation of waterways and soil, the destruction of species, and the damage to ecosystem services such as carbon sinks. All of these problems can be overcome by technology and by increased human capital, we are assured. But since I'm no expert in ecology either, I'm going to stick to something that I know a bit about, and it's to warn non-economists that the contribution of immigration to increase material prosperity isn't all it's cracked up to be. There's no doubt that net migration causes the economy to grow, to be bigger because there are more people. Businesses want a bigger economy because it gives them more people to sell to and profit from. From their self-interested perspective, that's quite rational. All they want to do is sell more and make more profits. They don't care whether that's in the interests of the economy. They know that it's in their interests, or as they perceive it anyway. But for economists and politicians, it's not good enough to assume that bigger is better, to believe in growth for its own sake. No, according to their narrow materialistic perspective, growth is only a good thing if it makes us better off, if it raises our material standard of living, if it increases real income per person. So growth has to lead to an increase in GDP per person, or else it doesn't achieve what economists promise us growth will achieve, and that is greater material prosperity for us all. Now here's the thing, although economists don't like to talk about it, don't like to think about it, plenty of studies have shown that immigration does little or nothing to raise real income per person. What little gain there is goes to the immigrants themselves, not to the pre-existing population that invited them in. This conventional but little trumpeted finding is confirmed by the most recent study undertaken by the Productivity Commission of all outfits in 2006. So why is it that adding extra workers tends not to raise the average standard of living? Well, it's well understood by economists. It's because all those extra people require additional spending on capital. capital broadening, as economists call it. If the average amount of capital per person isn't to fall, if you've got more people, then you have to have more capital. If you don't have that more capital, then the average capital per person falls. And if that falls, then living standards are likely to fall rather than rise. The extra people need to be supported by additional capital in their private lives, more housing, additional capital equipment in the firms where they work, and additional public infrastructure, more roads, more public transport, schools, hospitals, power and water. All of those things have to be added with the people to keep the material standard of living steady, let alone rising. Thus, the economic benefits of having more workers is essentially cancelled out by the cost of providing the extra capital that needs to go with them and their families, most of which has to be borrowed from foreigners. That is, where do we get this capital from? We borrow it from foreigners. So if we're going to have increased immigration, we'll certainly have a bigger current account deficit and a bigger foreign debt. The fashion among economists at present is to ignore this glaring drawback and focus on more seemingly appealing arguments, such as that higher immigration will reduce our problem with ageing, to which my response is true but exaggerated, and Professor Peter McDonald's argument that politicians don't determine the size of our immigration, the needs of the economy do. It's the ups and downs in the economy that cause the ups and downs in our immigration intake. Now, if you look at it historically, there's some truth to what he says. But having made that point, economists point to the resources boom and the massive increase in construction activity that the resources boom entails, and they conclude from that we must open the immigration floodgates to avoid skilled labour shortages and wage inflation. Actually, we only surrender our control over immigration to the economy when we proceed from the assumption that economic growth is pretty much the only thing that matters, and that the role of the natural environment can be left out of the model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's now question time. The phrase sustainability really hit the popular zeitgeist in the late 1980s, and it was introduced mainly by the environmental movement based on arguments from ecologists. The idea is that activities by humans have to operate within ecological cycles, and that if we can't operate within the ecological cycles of the planet, then therefore we are unsustainable, and that endeavour will have to collapse. But pretty soon after that hit the airwaves, the term seems to have been hijacked and hybridised mainly by economists and politicians, and there's a few on the board today, with terms like sustainable growth and sustainable development, which really seem to pay very little, if any, attention to the natural cycles of the planet. So just quickly round the panel, I'd like to know, is there a difference in the understanding of sustainability between the environmental movement and ecologists and biologists as opposed to what economists and politicians understand as sustainability? And if there is any chance of a nexus between those two ideas? Let's start right down the other end. Dick.
Well, most business people don't understand what sustainability means, and so they just shove it in front of everything because that's the in thing to do. And you mentioned sustainable development, or I mentioned sustainable population growth, where there's no such thing. That's why right at the start of my 5 minutes I described sustainability as not using more resources in a year than you replace. One simple way. There are lots of more academic ways. But no, politicians and business people do not understand what sustainability means, and if you tell them what it really means, they don't want to know, because basically it says our God of capitalism, the one of growth, is a false god, and we don't want to know that.
Nigel, I suspect you would disagree.
Well, you know, I was sort of reading a bit about what people do mean by sustainability, and the sort of the common definition seemed to be that somehow mankind doesn't change the environment. We grow, but we somehow don't change the environment. Now, in thousands of years, man, in sort of the population growing from trivial numbers to current numbers, has constantly changed the environment. So I think the notion that at some point we're not going to change the environment is, and that's what people are talking about. I mean, we have changed the environment, but you know, I think the point I was trying to make is that we are reaching a sort of a tipping point where we can actually see at some point down the track that the impact we're making on the world is going to start diminishing. So, but sort of jumping up and down about it, I mean, the reality is we've changed the world, we keep modifying it, and in doing so we've made it better for humans, but at the expense of bits of the environment. But it's always a choice.
Okay, Bob?
Gee, it's a bit more shaky than that, Nigel.
Yeah, of course.
We've changed the chemical, yeah, we have changed it, but we've changed the chemical composition of the atmosphere that surrounds the Earth. If you went up there and you filled a bottle with the atmosphere from the highest mountain on the planet in 1960 and compared it with what you get out of a bottle from the highest mountain on the planet in 2010, it's chemically different. That's the experiment. Fabulous experiment, isn't it? Great experiment. And we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to manage it. We're uncertain about how close we are to that frightening 2-degree average warming of the planet. We just don't know. I followed the debate. There's no consensus that it's not going to hit us in 2020, not going to get there in 2030, but we do know it's a whole lot closer than it was believed to be only 5 years ago. And what we've done with the upper atmosphere is only the first shock we're dealing with. The explosion in human numbers has changed the atmosphere around the planet, but it's beginning, the evidence is coming in about what it's done to the oceans. That might be an even bigger shock. The material about ocean acidification, and apparently what is a separate phenomenon, the large areas of dead ocean, could be where global warming was in 1970, just being speculated about, but about to hit us very hard. The area where these two concerns, the economic and the ecological meet, which is the essence of your question, is in pricing and regulation. If we price rural water properly, then you see a shift from wasteful, environmentally destructive broadacre irrigation, for example, into point irrigation or drip irrigation. And we go from growing cotton and rice to growing citrus, which is a better use of the water. And the way you give effect to that is to up the price of water. The other tool is simple regulation. We're the first state in Australia to adopt something that's called BASICS, which is a requirement that every new house in Sydney, now every new house in New South Wales, achieve 40% reductions in the amount of energy they use and the amount of water they use. There's a regulation. And it's brought down the size of new housing, I believe, unless that gain's recently been reversed. But it's meant every house being built with a water tank, a modern water tank, one that collects in the eaves and the tank's under the ground, water-saving devices and natural ventilation to reduce the reliance on air conditioning. So regulation can get us there, pricing can get us there, but it's not a cheerful picture of the planet just being changed and us all adapting. I think we're at quite a frightening point for our species, and it's all driven by this remorseless commitment to population growth.
Wendy, you actually touched in your...
What I'd like to see with basics, just to take up on something you said, Bob, was why is there no basics for retrofitting? Why is there not a measure of basics for retrofitted technologies, when people put a water tank on their house, when people engage in retrofitting their technologies? That's another question.
I think you're right. I think that economists and politicians have changed the definition of sustainability to suit their biases. It's not hard to understand why. How could a politician or even an economist say that they believed in unsustainability? So they have changed the definition. They've done it in the ways that I mentioned. They've done it by saying, well, look, we might be using up all these natural resources, but we've got this increase in human capital and it kind of compensates for that. So what's your problem? The other thing is this faith that technological advance will solve all future problems. Nigel's right when he says that as populations get richer, as women get better educated, and families get more money, they have fewer children. That's evident in the West, where just about every Western country has a fertility rate that's less than the replacement rate, and you can see it coming in the developing world. And when you project that out, as Nigel says, the population of the world is likely to stop growing by about 2050 and eventually start falling because the world gets richer and we don't, and richer people have fewer children. The question is whether or not the natural environment can wait that long. I think you're right in saying that there is this gap between economists and scientists. I think it's because both the scientists and the economists prefer to stay in their own common rooms and not talk to each other. I think the world would be a much better place if somehow or other we could get the economists and the physical scientists into the same room to debate these issues, whereas they prefer to debate them among themselves, and economists prefer not to think about any of this stuff. It's not in the model. We can run our economic games quite happily without worrying about this thing out there called the environment. But there are misunderstandings, not just on the economist side, but also on the scientist side, where they say we must have an end to growth. I presume they mean growth as measured by GDP. What scientists don't know, because they know very little economics, is that growth as measured by GDP comes in two varieties. One is growth that comes from increased use of resources, including increased use of natural resources, but also growth that comes from increased productivity. Which comes from your technological advance. Increased productivity, increased efficiency says we don't use more resources, we just get more goods and services out of them. Now, economists would be a lot less appalled by the argument that we should have an end to growth if they understood that what the scientists want is an end to the growth in the use of natural resources, and that there can be no objection to growth that comes from increased efficiency.
Let's go to a question from the floor.
My name is Nola Stewart from Sustainable Population Australia, and first I'd like to say thank you to all the speakers for their congenial and helpful presentations. For Nigel, you mentioned that rich countries are able to help the environment because they have this money to spend on it, but all money is generated by the productivity of the earth in the first place, by putting some natural ecosystem under production in either forestry, agriculture, mining or fisheries. In other words, all money comes from ecosystems destroyed in either the recent or more distant past. So one could ask, which ecosystem would you destroy in order to save the environment?
Am I under attack here?
Just for the moment, Nigel, it'll pass soon.
Yeah, I mean, Ross has been the nicest to me. But, okay. Well, I mean, Ross was making the point that sort of income growth doesn't just come from natural resources. It comes from lifting the productivity of the efficiency with which we use labour and sort of capital. So it doesn't come just from natural resources. But so look, I'm not going to name what we're going to destroy, but you know, we have modified the environment. That is absolutely true. But we are, you know, in this country, in my lifetime, I've seen us making modifications to the environment which have improved it. I mean, you look at Sydney Harbour today, and it's a dramatic improvement on 30 odd years ago. And I grew up in Adelaide, and the Port River, you know, as my father sort of described it, was an absolutely dreadful place, and now it's relatively clean. So we do actually have a capacity, by being rich, to actually improve that, and we do actually have a capacity to preserve. You know, as we get richer, we can actually preserve more of that natural environment. So, and we are seeing that happen. You know, you know, Tasmania, but it's happening in a lot of other places. Now, we would like it to happen elsewhere, but as countries get richer, they can afford to do that more. I mean, people in poor countries don't have any capacity to do this, you know, while we can gnash our teeth about world population and the like, we can't tell people in poor countries that they have to remain poor. I mean, they have a right to aspire to have better living standards, which, and with that, will go better quality of life. So somehow, you know, in a rich country, we sort of, you know, we carry on about this, and I understand that, and we can improve the environment here. But the people in the poor countries, they've got an absolute right to aspire to better living, which will give a better quality of life with that. Longevity. It's not something that people in rich countries like ourselves, which we enjoy, can keep to ourselves.
I have a real problem with Nigel when he says that we're going to, that in effect he's saying that the problem will naturally balance itself out because the figures show that in 40 years' time, when we go to 9.1 billion, the population will start to reduce. In fact, the problem is between now and then. If you believe in human-induced climate change, which I do, the problems are now. Virtually every problem we have on this earth is made worse by having more people. We are incredibly irresponsible to be paying baby bonuses and encouraging people to have more children. The whole world should be told that we already have too many people. We have passed the sweet spot. And that's obvious. The world is crying out and telling us that, and we're incredibly dumb, and that's why I said, young people under the age of 30, you're the people who have to become the politicians that say we can have a very successful economic system without continually growing the population and without continually using more resources and energy. The positive news for the young people is if you take control, we can have a far more successful world. But if it gets to 9.1 billion, there's already 1 billion malnourished. You can't possibly have 9.1 billion by 2050 and not completely destroy this world.
Next question.
My name's Nicholas Carr, and I was formerly with the CRC for Irrigation Futures. And this is to the economists here. You've said we can have growth and so on at the expense of you know, natural resources. Well, everything that I've come across in irrigation tells me that we're not going to be able to feed 9.1 billion people under any circumstance. Now, the population bomb book in the 70s said that we're all going to starve. Well, we didn't. We had a green revolution. It's not going to happen again. We don't have the water. We don't have the new untapped fossil fuels and land to expand on to realise food growth that's greater or equal to population growth. It's just not going to happen. Now, what's going to happen for us here is that our food price is going to go up from 3% of our salaries to 5%, and we're just not going to care. But for people in Bangladesh, they're really going to care. Now, China's going to start importing food in a few years, net import, and they're never, ever going to stop, in my lifetime anyway. So my question to Ross is, why can economists not see this? I know this is a scientific thing, but the rates are all there. These are published figures.
They can't see it because they don't look.
And we also believe that human beings are so bloody ingenious that every one of you scientists who've predicted doom and failure in the past have been wrong. So we say, you'll always be wrong. Of course you won't be. As you say, there's the second law of thermodynamics. So we will run out of resources. But because we've always been allowed to get away with it, people are stupid. And I can see terrible things happening with this Earth because people think scientists have always been wrong, take no notice of it. Interesting, every wealthy friend of mine is a climate change denier. I don't have one wealthy friend who believes that humans are having any effect on climate. Yeah. It's the young people who will change it. You'll get young people who come along and say it's a fact and we have to do something about it, because the reason most people of my age and older are climate change deniers is it won't affect us. We'll be dead. But I'm absolutely amazed that a learned organisation, I'm a car radio installer, you're the people who have the qualifications. You should be out there doing something about it. In the 60s, we demonstrated. The young people today do nothing. What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you?
You know, earlier I was going to accuse you of playing to the audience, but this is from Jay Donnelly. And she would say that would Australia be able to cope with a higher population if more people lived in smaller regional cities other than Sydney, Melbourne, Perth and Brisbane? Or is there evidence that in all Australia we can only produce enough food, water for a certain amount of people? And Wendy, I think you would be the person to answer that question.
Food production is not actually a problem at the moment. There is plenty of food. And there is so much food that is thrown out. Milk is thrown into the ocean. There is food wasted en masse. The problem with food is that it is a commodity. It's a marketable commodity. It's not a right. So food is something that is afforded by the people who can afford it. So if food can be grown as it is and can be produced, then sure, regional centres can take more people.
I just want to dispel with this idea that somehow we can accommodate a population of 50 million, 100 million quite easily if we just settle people. Listen, there are no internal passports in Australia. You can't say to migrants at the point of a bayonet, you're welcome, but you've got to settle in Wagga. You can't do that. And there have been studies of a refugee community that settled in Perth with free housing. They were given public housing. Within a short period of time, they gravitated to Sydney. They came to Sydney even though there was no offer of public housing. They took their chances in the private rental market. But they came here because there are other members of their language/cultural group in Sydney. People come overwhelmingly to the big cities. Yes, there are charming exceptions, like the Afghan refugees who have all got jobs in an abattoir in regional New South Wales. Terrific stories. But overwhelmingly, the growth will be in the big cities. That's how it works. Yep. And by the way, have you ever heard of the water problem in Australia? Even in this new wet phase we've entered, Goulburn was running out of water. You telling me that Goulburn, conveniently located to be a satellite city for Sydney, is able to take 500,000? They were running out of water. They were contemplating potable water being trucked in only a year ago. Canberra was stopping new suburbs when I last examined this question. I think it was 3 years ago or 4 years ago, because they didn't have the drinking water. I met a dairy farmer the other day from the Goulburn Valley in Victoria who'd had to close his farm. There was no water. Melbourne, to sustain its growth, is sucking water out of regional Victoria. And that restricts the growth of regional centres, even if there was some policy device to say to new migrants, we're taking you, but you've got to settle in these smaller centres. I'm just telling you, we run these ambitious population targets. We say cheerfully we can take 60 million, 100 million, as Harry Triguboff's been urging. It simply means a densification of urban development up the east coast of Australia. It means an eastern Australia with tract housing and clusters of skyscrapers and shopping malls and a loss of the natural world and the coastline that I think is part of the appeal of living on this continent. We're a coastal people, and this is a debate about intensification of coastal development.
Okay, just quickly to Dick.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question too. I agree totally with Bob that you can't solve our population problem by putting people inland. The greatest, people say, look, America has 300 million people in roughly the same land area. The United States has the Rocky Mountains, the Colorado River and the Mississippi River. All of our rivers added up don't add up to half the flow of the Mississippi. And our inland cities are arid. We're an arid country. We don't have the water. And so to think we can solve a problem by just putting people into the country, it's ridiculous. I would hazard a guess that we've probably got too many people in this country now. And we have that many people because we're now a net importer of fruit and vegetables, We have huge desalination plants in every city because for the last 15 years, Warragamba Dam's been about half empty. And if there is not a message there, that there are too many people. Thank you.
Okay, Wendy.
Basically agree with Bob that most people will want to live in their cultural groups which tend to gravitate towards cities. I will say about water, and I am not an expert on this, but I work with plenty of water scientists who say Australia does not have a water problem. It has a water distribution and use problem. The dams are all in the wrong places.
That's ridiculous, sorry.
They're in the rain shadows, not in the rain shadows, not in the catchments aren't in the right places. There is plenty of water in this country. It is just not managed properly. In plenty of other places there are water recycling and different styles of water waste management that we don't have here. We use potable water for everything, including washing the footpath.
I'm going to have to move it along because we are almost running out of time. What is Australia's sustainable population? Dick?
I have no idea because the scientific community has let us down. The scientific community, the academics of this country, I've said to them, when our last Prime Minister said he welcomed a big Australia of 36 million, I went to the CSIRO and said, where's the study that shows we'll have enough food? There is no study. The universities and the research institutions in this country have let us down.
Okay, Nigel, can you put a number on it?
Look, no, I'm not going to put a number on it, but it's certainly, look,
is it greater or less than the current population?
It's substantially bigger than our current population. And just can I just say on water, and there's a bit of a tendency to shoot the messenger here. Economists are the messenger, so I'm being shot tonight.
We do love you, Nigel. Don't get us wrong.
But that's okay. I've got a thick skin. Just on water, I mean, we have, and you know, Bob's probably been part of it. We've seen a move to the proper pricing of water, and we've seen substantial behavioural changes, which means that while in Sydney we built the Warragamba Dam, I think around the 1960s, and we haven't built anything substantially since, but we have seen significant change in behaviour. So, you know, my old neighbour used to water the street. When he got a large water bill, when the price went up, he stopped watering the street. So we've seen that very significant change, and we're moving into a phase where, with the Murray-Darling and all those issues, we are going to be pricing water more correctly, and it's going to have a significant change. And so it is going to allow us to support more people, just literally in terms of water. So in terms of water, while clearly we're a dry continent and we live through droughts, it's part of Australia, we do, in terms of water, have a capacity to have a larger population. Okay, thank you.
Bob, have you got a number for me?
I'm going to answer it this way. I haven't a number. I agree with Nigel on this. These are the things I would relate population growth to, key indicators. But a quick correction, a quick tweaking of Nigel's view then. Sydney has 11 dams. Warragamba is one of them. Sydney's water capacity in proportion to its population is the highest of any Australian capital. In the last drought, the drought that's just ended, every other Australian capital was under acute pressure. Turnbull was chortling in a private conversation. He said, Peter Beattie's going to be embarrassed. Brisbane's going to be the first Australian capital to have to distribute potable water street by street. Adelaide was 1 year away from that. Perth, acute. Melbourne, biggest desal plant in Australia. Sydney's got the biggest water capacity of any capital city in Australia. Warragamba's one of 11 dams that service it. I'd like to see the figure related to these indicators. Urban density. If we have Perth and Brisbane and Melbourne achieving the urban consolidation targets that Sydney's got, 70% of all new housing from established areas, not from the urban fringe, then we're being honest. We can see a higher than lower immigration intake. Here's another key indicator, the ratio of public transport to private vehicle journeys. Sydney's got 27% of its population travelling by public transport. Melbourne lags. Melbourne's at 17%, and all the other Australian capitals are down. If we lift that proportion, yes, I'm prepared to have a debate about higher rather than lower annual intakes. Here's another indicator, and it's the one Nigel's referred to quite accurately, emphasising the pricing issue, reducing water consumption per head, taking up Wendy's point a moment ago about profligate use of potable water. Water efficiency, another key indicator. Greenhouse emissions per head, that's a key indicator. And I want one of the advocates of a population of 50 million or 100 million to be honest and say, we've got to address greenhouse emissions per head. I'm in favour of nuclear power, a nuclear power plant. I want the advocates, you see, I want the advocates of 100 million population for Australia to say that it's only viable with a desal plant on every headland, I exaggerate slightly, and with nuclear generation. I want that sort of candour. Just as I want them to say they favour the rebuilding of large parts of our capital cities, especially along major transport arteries, as high rise. I want them to be honest about this. So they're the indicators I'd relate it to, and I'm not going to nominate a figure, but an honest debate around those key indicators and an honest debate about what higher population means.
I'm determined I'm going to get a number before the night's out. Wendy, are you going to provide it for me? What is Australia's sustainable population?
We have to consider ourselves as part of a global community, and therefore people are moving around for a range of reasons. So they'll be moving here for a range of reasons. We are part of the Asia Pacific, and we are part of the global community.
Ross, you're a numbers man.
Sorry
Can you give me that number?
I'm sorry to be the last person to disappoint you, but I don't have a number because the work hasn't been done. Dick blames it on the scientists, maybe, but I think that if the politicians wanted to explore that question, they would have offered some money, and in my experience, scientists go where the money is. I think that our politicians haven't wanted to explore that area. Now, I'm sure that even if you did have the best scientific brains working on this, they wouldn't come up with a single magic number. They'd come up with a whole pile of scenarios and conditional projections and all the rest of it. But even that would leave us with a better idea of what we're talking about than we've got now.
And could I just add one other thing?
Okay, well, why not, Dick?
Very important. Australian families can have up to 20 kids during their lifetime. Very few do. So all Australian families make a decision on an optimum number, whether it's be 2, 3, 4 or 5 or whatever it is. It's quite interesting how, but when it comes to our country, we just go for the max. There is no optimum number discussed, and I think that's extraordinary. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a stimulating set of ideas that have been presented by 5 beautiful minds. Would you please put your hands together for Dick, Nigel, Bob, Wendy and Ross.
What are you laughing at?
And I'd now like to hand over to Professor Kevin Fox, who is the head of the School of Economics of the Australian School of Business here.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to wrap things up tonight. I'll be brief. Just a few words on each of the panellists and their comments tonight. First, in Dick Smith, we have a modern-day Malthus. Malthus, hundreds of years ago, predicted that humanity was heading towards disaster. We wouldn't be able to feed ourselves because agricultural production would not keep pace with the population growth. And this was a mathematical certainty. We're still here and the population's still growing. What has happened? Well, one of the answers to this is something which Nigel Staples suggested, and that is the role of technology. You just have to think about the wonderful contributions that scientists have made to our human existence. Hydroponics, okay? You can grow not only marijuana in your closet, you can grow tomatoes there, right? Now, Bob Carr, could he possibly be the first politician who does not like people? Wendy Sure briefly touched on the contributions of immigrants to our society, and we just have to think of some prominent current immigrants, Tony Abbott, Julia Gillard, Christina Keneally, but don't let that put you off the idea of having more immigration. Finally, Ross Gittins, thank you for the reminder that economists are stupid. As a stupid economist, I'm unable to debate that. Eleanor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize last year for her work related to environmental economics.
Yes,
So,
except that she's not an economist, she's a political scientist.
well, we have adopted her
That's
as
the problem
one
with
of our
economics.
own.
Look, there's an eagle.
We are a broad church, and we welcome even an occasional accountant, Ross. Now, and it's important, Ross mentioned that economists were obsessed with maximising profit. In fact, that's the accountant's game. Economists are about maximising utility. This is microeconomics 1. What do consumers do? They want to maximise utility, their satisfaction. So what determines their satisfaction is preferences. And this gives us a glimmer of hope in all this debate about environmental sustainability. Ultimately, it will come down to the choices that we make and what makes us happy, what we choose to consume, how we choose to live our lives. As our preferences change, we move away from wanting bigger plasma TV screens to wanting better national parks, cleaner water, better air quality. And I think this gives us some idea of how we can move forward in the future. And I thank the panellists for helping stimulate my thinking on this topic. So please join me in thanking them for their wonderful contributions. And I think that concludes things for the evening. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.